So Chris Salter, on the far left there, is an artist, and he's a Concordia University Research Chair in New Media Technology and the Senses, Concordia in Montreal, and a professor of computation arts in the Department of Design and Computation Arts, and co-director of the Hexagram Network, which is a big research group that crosses several universities in Montreal. Chris.
Thanks, Nell. So I just want to also thank Ryan and everybody at Art Engine for the invitation. It's been great yesterday and also today. So I want to contrast two projects in my talk. One is from a massive Hollywood machinery which just opened in LA. I'm not going to talk too much about this project, and the other is a project that I developed that I'm mainly going to talk about today called Artifical, which has been touring in Europe since last year. And what they do is they pose two very different models of bodily experience. So one is based on virtual reality, this alien zoo, and the other is based on what we might call mixed reality, which is the kind of mixing between the digital and the physical. The other difference is that one amplifies the sensorium, your experience of the senses, and gives you everything, and the other removes vision. Haptic field, so the other senses kind of take over. So I'm going to just show you this weird review I just found on YouTube of this project because there's no documentation of this. This is just opened and it's obviously very, it was in stealth mode. So this gives you a little bit of sense of this alien zoo pop-up project that's going to be franchised around the world by this new company called Dreamscape Immersive, which is Steven Spielberg is behind it and big movie companies. Okay, now we're going to see if I push that button. Once more.
What's going on? Rich DeMiro here, Rich on Tech, and I want to tell you about a virtual reality experience I did that is literally unbelievable. I have never done anything like this. So let me explain. I love VR. I think virtual reality is going to be the future of everything. But realistically, all these little headsets and stuff we have, none of them come close to what I experienced through something called Alien Zoo. So this is a new 1-month pop-up immersive experience that's available at the Westfield Century City Mall. That's in West Los Angeles. And Alien Zoo is kind of like the name of the experience. It comes from a company called Dreamscape Immersive. So who is Dreamscape Immersive? Well, this is their first big public-facing project. It is open now. And here's the deal. There are some heavy hitters behind this company. Investors including AMC, because they know cinema is changing. You've got IMAX. You've got former heads of studios like DreamWorks. You've got 3 Hollywood studios on board. Steven Spielberg is an investor in this thing and part of it. So these are some big people with big roots in entertainment, and they are looking for sort of the next big thing in entertainment. And I will be honest, I think they found it. So I don't want to give everything away about what happens, but imagine you step into a virtual world and you are part of it, and you're part of the storyline. You're part of the experience. So let me explain how this happens. So you go to Century City Mall, you get a little ticket for this experience called Alien Zoo, and you walk in, and there's 6 people at a time that get to go to a showing. And the show is 12 minutes, okay? And I can't even call it a show because it's really an experience. So you go inside, and it's really cool looking inside. I mean, just the design of it is really neat. And I don't know what the premise is, but you're kind of an explorer, or adventurer, whatever you want. And then you go and you get suited up. So they literally put a VR headset on you, a backpack on you, some sort of gloves on your hands and also on your feet. So that way, your entire body, and I didn't realize this until all of a sudden it happens, you turn virtual. So when you go into this pod, you see 6 other people with you. The 6 people that are standing next to you, all of a sudden, when they flip this switch, you all turn virtual.
That's called motion capture, but it's in real time. All right. Now, this is Haptic Field. This was presented in Europe last summer. This is one of the largest museums in Berlin, the Martin Gropiusbau, in an exhibition on immersion. And this describes a little bit of this experience. Well, maybe not. Let's see. Okay, right. Sorry.
Haptic Field tries to create a kind of experience where the senses start to merge and mix together. Visitors arrive and they put on a garment When one is in this suit, one emits light and one also feels vibration. People put on these goggles, which basically cloud their vision, and then they move through a series of rooms that have varying levels of sensory input. You don't really have a sense of depth. You only see other people moving as shadows that emit light. So there's a kind of weird communication happening between each body in the room. And then you start to move through the other spaces. Occasionally the room completely becomes white. At times it becomes very, very dark. Suddenly the walls seem to emit light. The final space is saturated in a kind of dim color, which is changing very gradually. In many ways, the visitor's experience is the content of the work. There's an incredibly wide range of experiences that people describe, from terror to ecstasy to a kind of meditative state. I see the work as a relation between people and their environments and how those things are merging and interacting with each other.
So here's a little bit of just a short impression of this. Okay, so this is what we call kind of performative environment or sensory environment. So the public moves through a series of luminous and sonic spaces within a kind of continual time frame. So some people stay 20 minutes, some people stay 40, 50 minutes, even sometimes longer. And there are different groups of people, up to 18 people at a time can be in this environment. And so you enter, this is the line, people line up and then they put on this clothing. And then we put on these actuators, which are small devices. They're similar to the technologies in your cell phone. They're all wirelessly controlled. They're called the vibropixels because they both produce light, but they also produce vibration at certain points on the body. And then basically the audience puts on these kinds of safety goggles, which are just frosted. But the frosting does something very strange because what it does is it clouds your vision. It doesn't remove it entirely, but it clouds it. So your understanding of how you find visual cues in space, how you move toward objects is completely transformed and disturbed. So it's as if you're walking through a kind of fog where you can see, but you can't really see. And of course, then you start to feel these kinds of vibrations across your body. And so sometimes the sense is that what you're feeling on your body, you're actually seeing in space because certain of the lights are synchronized with those vibrations, and sometimes they're not. Now, each of the rooms, so in this environment, there were 4 very large-scale rooms, about 190 square meters, moving through these spaces, and each one has a different kind of state to it. One is very, very dark, and so you're not really particularly sure of where you are. And then you enter into a much larger room where you have many, many of these points of light hanging at different heights in the ceiling. But again, these lights are blurred. They're quite, let's say, like haloed in a way. This is this big room, and of course there's other people around you. And so there's accompanying kinds of sound structures as well. In one room there's binaural audio, which is kind of moving back and forth, beating between two very close frequencies. So you tend to hear sounds that are actually not there. One room is much more saturated. Sometimes the room suddenly goes black and then bursts with very bright white xenon light, which is very, very cold white light. So your whole field of vision vanishes briefly. And then you go into a room in which the light is no longer in the air, but on the wall. And in fact, every point of light emits sound as well. So as you move toward the light, you hear sound coming out of it. And you're also, again, feeling these vibrations on you. And then the final room is this kind of room, again, video can't demonstrate this because the colors and the shapes are very different in terms of your vision versus what the camera sees. But there's a kind of a field of light above you. It's not around you, but it's somehow in the air, and you don't know where it is. And so there's a sense of kind of a void in space. Now, what becomes interesting is that there are patterns that kind of take place. So it's very, very scored. There's no interaction in the sense that there's some kind of sensor that measures, like what David was showing earlier, the very nervous system earlier project of his, in which your movement is picked up by a camera, and then that camera, the sensor basically maps that to some type of media. There's none of that. But at the same time, there's an incredible amount of interaction. And we think of interaction as human interaction with the environment, as you see kind of in this images of people holding each other and falling and dancing and, kind of getting lost. Now, the interesting thing is, my question is, what happens to oneself in haptic field? And why did I show you this Alien Zoo project earlier? Well, what we've done, not only as artists, but also from a kind of a research perspective, is interview audiences after these experiences. And we've done this in China, we've done this in Europe, we're about to do it in Indonesia in this summer. So very, very different cultural context. In Berlin, we interviewed around 100 people out of the 12,000 that came for 1 month to this exhibition. And we're trying to understand their responses to the work. What's actually happening to them? What's happening to their bodies in space? What's happening to others around them? So what's interesting here is that there's a kind of diffused or dispersed perceiving of the world. And so many of the visitors in our interviews, and there's a group of people who are speaking together. It's my team, but it's also the audience in small groups. So it's not individuals, it's actually groups of 4 or 5 people. So people speak and then start to share collectively their experience, even though they can't necessarily see the others. What becomes very interesting is that people describe the presence, the sense of others around them, but they cannot see them. So they sense somebody, but unlike, for instance, this virtual VR project I showed you earlier, there's no direct one-to-one correspondence between my body and everybody else's, So it's diffused. You sense somebody, but you cannot see them. And so if you can't see somebody, you start to behave in your body very differently than if you can see someone. So what happened, for instance, is people start to do things, and they say this, that they normally would not do in everyday life. They start dancing, they start doing weird kinds of movements, they start moving slowly. They kind of start performing for themselves, but for others, but without the fear of the social mores taking place that you see when, like, if I started to take my clothes off here, you would be like, okay, that's very strange. But people would do that in that room because you would only get a sense of, like, the presence, but not the representation of a body. The other interesting thing is that there's a term that comes from the 1960s from an anthropologist named Edward T. Hall, called proxemics. And proxemics are the sense of how culture creates certain distances between us. We establish certain understanding of space based on our cultural understanding, our cultural training. And what becomes very interesting in haptic field is that goes out the window. So, normally you wouldn't get too close to somebody if you didn't know them. Well, people started to touch. You watch people try to touch others not knowing they're there. You don't know where they are in space because they're actually not in your field of vision. So people would go reach out into nothingness, and the person would be 5 or 6 feet away from them, and then they would try to move toward the other person. Well, the other person would kind of move backwards. So we would watch these kinds of very interesting dynamics that occurred. Now, just to finish up, the comments people have are extremely interesting. One person said they felt like they were connected to everyone. They didn't care who they were. They didn't even care about their gender or their, it was beyond gender, they actually said. They felt connected like fireflies do. You know, so they felt that others were fireflies. Another woman claimed that she felt like she was moving through the stages of her life. She said, well, it's dark, and then I see some light, and I move toward it, but it's actually not there, and I stumble, and I feel like I'm falling, and then I realize this is how I experience the world. It's like I try to grasp for something, and then it's not there, and then I grasp again, and then it appears, but I can't hold on to it. So in many ways, haptic field is a kind of work for the attention overwhelmed. You know, so no one can go on their phone and check Facebook. They can't. They're not connected to the electronic world in any way, even though they're in a completely artificial, technologized space. You know, and there's a term that James Austin, who's a neuroscientist and also a Zen practitioner, has written this very large book many years ago called Zen in the Brain. Talks about when he talks about the notion of absorption, and he says that in absorption, involves a kind of change of focus, but it also signifies a sense of being held or transfixed or riveted, in which other energy infuses the act of attending to something. And I start to find that most of my work is very much about this act of attending. How do you attend to things that are not actually perceptually apparent or clear to you? And because our attention is so fragmented by swiping on the phone and looking at the Instagram feed, or by constantly receiving input, when the input of the environment becomes reduced, your attention starts to transform. And I'll just finish up and play you one comment. So there was an earlier project we did called ilinx, which is a term in Greek which means vertigo. And ilinx was a similar project, although it involved 4 people as opposed to a whole group, and they were also wearing clothing that has wireless, like embedded vibration in it. It was more complex. Again, people went through a very large environment without kind of knowing where they were. But for the first 7 minutes, they sat in total darkness, and they just felt almost micro-level vibrations across their body. And then in the second part, they were asked to walk through a very large space. And this is a group of very famous musicians from the US called Underground Resistance who went through the environment. And I'll just play you a comment from one of them.
The space felt like after you got an operation and you didn't make it, you died. And you're wondering what's coming next. And you're dead, you know you're dead, but the electronic part of you is still going. And you can't, everything that you knew is gone, and you don't know what to expect. And it's just, it was the strangest feeling. The further into it you went, the further away from what you knew.
So I find that very interesting. The further into it, the further you didn't know. And so in very interesting ways, I think these projects deal with the fact that the more presence or the more embodied we feel, the less we have a sense of the self that we so hold on to so dearly. Thank you.